welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be diving in again.
This is actually our third time digging into Nick Nuancer's blog archive, Nick's Nuances. And every time there's something really thought-provoking.
Absolutely. This one's called The Paradox of Perfect Bliss, How Desire Shapes Our Conceptions of Heaven, Nirvana, and Human Meaning.
Yeah, and it's from the 2024 archive, but honestly, the themes feel completely timeless. That's sort of what Nick does well.
Right.
Across philosophy, religion, psychoanalysis, culture.
It really is. So for this deep dive, our mission really is to unpack this central puzzle Nick lays out.
Which is?
Well, it's this fundamental tension, between our very human experience of desire, of wanting things, and how we often imagine paradise.
Like heaven or nirvana.
Exactly. Places where wanting is supposed to just stop. Cease.
It's a really interesting place to start, isn't it? Thinking about our ultimate idea of happiness, perfect bliss, and how that might actually tell us something about what makes life meaningful, well, right now.
It totally does. So let's think about that common promise you find across different traditions.
Christian heaven, Buddhist nirvana, even like secular utopias.
Right. The core idea is often, the end of suffering, getting all the answers, finally being content. And a huge piece of that is the end of wanting.
You hear about cessation, or just eternal bliss, where there's no more striving, no more feeling like something's missing.
Precisely. But, okay, here's where the puzzle really kicks in. How does that promise-ending desire actually square with how we experience satisfaction, how we find meaning day to day? Nick points out something that I think we all kind of recognize. That intense joy you feel when you achieve something, it often fades, right? Pretty quickly after the success.
Yeah, the peak is short-lived.
Or the thrill of finally getting something you really, really wanted, it diminishes. Possession sort of lessens the wanting.
Definitely.
And even the deepest, most lasting pleasures. They often seem to need some element of anticipation or effort, maybe even a sense of incompleteness to keep their meaning.
That really rings true. It's like the journey, the wanting itself, is part of what makes the destination feel like anything.
Exactly. And following that pattern leads to the core question the source puts to us, to you listening. What if our capacity for meaning, for finding life meaningful, is actually inseparable from experiencing lack, from desire itself?
Whoa. Okay. Let's sit with that for a second.
Yeah.
Imagine achieving literally everything. Perfect happiness, total knowledge, eternal bliss, forever.
Yeah.
And crucially, absolutely zero desire for anything else. No yearning.
Does that state still feel meaningful? That thought experiment, that's the heart of the paradox.
Right.
And the source isn't, trying to argue whether an afterlife exists or not. That's not the point here.
It's more about how our ideas about it, our conceptions of paradise.
Exactly. The stories we tell reveal this fundamental tension within human desire, and maybe more importantly, how that tension shapes how we engage with reality today.
So it's less about theology in a strict sense and more about, well, psychology, philosophy maybe, using these afterlife ideas as a kind of mirror for being human.
That's a great way to put it. And what's fascinating is thinking about desire and longing not just as like problems we need to fix or transcend.
Which is how they're often framed.
Right. But what if they're part of the fundamental fabric of what makes us? Us. The source argues that meaningful consciousness, the kind we have, might inherently need some kind of striving, some limitation, just to exist.
Sort of like reaching a mountain summit.
Yeah.
The meaning isn't just being there, but it comes from the fact the mountain was separate, something you had to strive towards. It remains, in a way, unattainable even when you're on top.
That's one analogy the piece uses. Or think about an American football game.
Okay.
The excitement, the engagement, it comes from the uncertainty, right? The back and forth, wanting your team to score, hoping they'll win.
Yeah, the tension.
Now, imagine a game that's just a total blowout, like 49-0 by halftime. The outcome is basically certain.
It gets boring fast.
Right. The source points out how hollow that feels. Players might ease up. Spectators might start checking their phones. Why? Because that sustained engagement with desire, with uncertainty, it's gone. The meaning wasn't just in the final score, it was in the wanting, the process.
The striving was where the juice was, not just the state of having won.
Exactly. And this insight about what makes experience meaningful leads the piece to look really closely at traditional ideas of paradise.
Okay, so let's take the Christian conception first.
Well, the source makes this interesting point that Christian religious experience itself often shows this paradox. The power, the energy in it often seems to lie not in some perfect static union already achieved,
but in the gap.
Yes. In that persistent space between the believer and the divine, the faith needed, the struggle against sin, reading scripture, the act of worship.
That distance, that feeling of not quite there yet, that's where so much the meaning and, well, the tension of earthly faith lives.
It really does.
Yeah.
And the source suggests that maybe when people imagine heaven as, say, eternal worship, they might be, perhaps unconsciously, trying to preserve that vital space, that distance that gives their earthly faith so much meaning.
Because it's hard for us to even imagine eternal bliss without somehow smuggling back in some element of longing or separation or desire, because those things are just so baked into how we experience meaning.
That seems to be the argument. And the piece also brings up that classic question about the fall from Eden.
Right. If a fall from a perfect state was possible once.
What fundamentally stops it from happening again in heaven? A truly unchanging, static state doesn't really seem to address that potential vulnerability, does it?
That's a tricky one. And then you have other ideas, more dynamic concepts of heaven.
Like spiritual progression or continuous discovery.
Yeah. And those seem to try and solve the boring paradise problem. But they raise their own questions, don't they?
They do. Like, if meaningful free will and growth can exist in heaven without any possibility of evil or suffering, why did we need the whole earthly journey in the first place? Why wasn't that perfect dynamic state the starting point?
Okay, this feels like where it gets really, really chewy. Some traditions talk about a radical transformation, right? Ideas from Scripture, like 1 Corinthians about a heavenly body, or Revelation saying the old order is passed away.
Exactly. The idea being maybe we're transformed into something fundamentally different. A self that's just free from desire and lack as we know it.
And on the surface, that sounds like it could solve the paradox. If the structures that make desire necessary are just gone, then the new self doesn't need it.
Right, but, and this is a big but in the source, the counter-argument is pretty powerful. If you are transformed that fundamentally, are you still you?
The identity problem.
Yeah. Our identity, our memories, relationships, values, the things that give us meaning seem so deeply shaped by our limits, by our desires. Even something like love, the source notes, seems bound up with yearning, with distance, with recognizing the other as other.
So a consciousness genuinely free from all that, it would be radically different, maybe unrecognizable as human experience.
It might be, like a new creation perhaps, but is it the same person who lived and loved and struggled on earth?
The source uses that analogy from Paul, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About a seed and the plant it becomes.
Right, 1 Corinthians 15. Related, yes, but fundamentally different in its form, its way of being. It makes you question if there even is a core self that exists totally independent of how we experience the world through desire and limitation.
Even concepts like being born again in this life, they transform you within your existing personality, right?
Yeah.
They don't erase it and replace it with something alien.
That's a key distinction. So the question hanging there is, does this idea of radical transformation actually make the promise of eternal life less appealing? If it's going to be lived by someone who is effectively a different being from you're right now.
It's a profound question. And Nick, in the piece, suggests that these kinds of theological puzzles, especially this transformation issue, might resonate with ideas from psychoanalysis, like Lacan.
Yeah, it's mentioned briefly. Lacan's thought is notoriously complex, but the core idea applied here is something like this. Maybe these struggles to imagine a desireless state aren't just theological knots, but reflections of how human subjectivity itself works. Meaning that maybe our conscious experience is fundamentally constituted by desire and lack. That the fall, in this view, isn't just a story about the past, but a kind of myth for how subjectivity itself emerges through separation, through noticing a gap. It asks, could consciousness, as we know it, even exist without that fundamental structure of desire?
Okay, wow. So shifting gears a bit, how does the source approach Buddhist ideas like Nirvana? That seems like a very different model.
It is a different vision, definitely, though as the piece is careful to note, Buddhism isn't monolithic. There's huge diversity within it.
Sure.
But in some traditional schools, like Theravada, you see practices aimed at something called Nirvana Samapati. It's described as a state of cessation, literally extinguishing feeling and perception, which in some interpretations could lead to a loss of consciousness as we typically understand it. It's a very direct attempt to eliminate desire and subjectivity.
Which contrasts quite sharply with, say, Vajrayana or Dzogchen traditions where desire and emotions might be seen more as energy to be worked with, transformed.
Exactly. But even in those traditions aiming for cessation, the source points out this really telling paradox.
That is?
the very pursuit of non-desire, well, it becomes an object of desire itself. You have to want to stop wanting. You have to desire to get beyond desire.
Huh. It's a kind of spiritual catch-22, isn't it?
It does seem like a loop, and the traditional goal of nirvana is often framed as a kind of void or a negation of subjectivity, which is quite different from the Christian idea of fulfillment or transformation into a perfected being.
One aims for dissolution, the other for perfection.
But both, in their own ways, seem to grapple with the nature of desire by imagining its end, and yet both seem to rely on desire as the very engine to even try and get there.
Now, Buddhist philosophy has, of course, developed incredibly sophisticated responses to these kinds of apparent paradoxes. Ideas like skillful means, or the doctrine of no self in that man, or the teaching that enlightenment isn't something to attain because we're already fundamentally awake.
Absolutely, and the source acknowledges that sophistication, but it argues that even these responses, in a way, inadvertently demonstrate how inescapable that structure of desire seems to be. Well, skillful means, for instance. You need to want to use them skillfully, to apply them correctly towards the goal. The realization of no self becomes something you desire to understand or experience. Even the idea that you're already enlightened often creates a subtle desire to recognize or actualize that supposed state.
So any movement away from our current condition seems to operate using the very structure of desire it claims it wants to leave behind.
That's the observation the source makes. It's not presented as a critique intended to invalidate these traditions' goals, but more as an observation about what the attempt to completely transcend desire reveals about our human condition.
It suggests that the fantasy itself, the fantasy of getting completely beyond desire, maybe that points to desire not being just a contingent problem, something to be fixed.
But maybe something more fundamental. Perhaps the very structure that makes conscious experience, engagement, and meaning possible for us in the first place. The sheer diversity within Buddhism itself, grappling with elimination versus engagement versus transformation of desire, might even underscore this core tension inherent in spiritual seeking.
So maybe concepts like nirvana or heaven function less as literal destinations we can fully grasp or achieve.
And more as powerful ideas, as fantasies perhaps, that structure our spiritual longing. They necessarily remain just beyond our conceptual reach, maybe.
And their real value, then, might lie less in their promise about the future and more in how they shape our engagement with the present moment, how they make us think about meaning now.
That seems to be a central thread. When we really try to pin down a truly static, perfect, desireless state, our descriptions often end up, maybe unconsciously, smuggling back in elements of dynamism or longing. Even descriptions of heavenly bliss might talk about continuous discovery or learning.
Tacitly admitting that meaningful existence, as we can conceive it, seems to require that space of desire, that movement towards something.
And the source suggests this isn't necessarily a failure of our imagination, but maybe a reflection of how absolutely fundamental desire is to the human experience as we live it.
Okay, so these are some pretty deep philosophical and theological waters we're swimming in. What happens when we look at actual human experiences, things that seem to touch the transcendent? The source brings in near-death experiences, NDEs, as a kind of case study here.
Right. NDEs are really fascinating in this context because they offer a window into how people encounter and then interpret experiences that feel incredibly real, like glimpses beyond ordinary reality. And we can see how desire and our existing mental structures still play a role.
The really striking thing about NDEs is often the reports themselves, isn't it? People describing vivid, sometimes life-changing experiences, often called realer than real, during periods where, medically speaking, there might be minimal brain activity.
Exactly. Descriptions of transcendent awareness, feeling connected to everything, expanded perception, sometimes even ego dissolution. States that seem to step way outside our normal everyday limitations.
Yes, and this is the source's point. Even within these seemingly transformed states, familiar human ways of making meaning and maybe even subtle forms of desire seem to be operating. They shape the experience, make it understandable to the person afterwards.
And this leads the source to propose that NDEs might be, at least partly, manifestations of what it terms ideological fantasies.
Okay, that phrase ideological fantasies sounds potentially dismissive. What exactly does the source mean by it? Is it saying they aren't real?
No, not necessarily saying they aren't subjectively real or deeply significant to the experiencer. That's crucial. What the term points to, and the evidence used, is how often the specific content of NDEs seems to align very closely with the person's existing beliefs, their cultural background, their pre-existing ideology in a broad sense. Okay. So, Someone from a Hindu background might report seeing Hindu deities or experiencing things related to reincarnation narratives.
While someone from a Christian background is more likely to report seeing Jesus or angels or familiar Christian imagery.
So the specific details of the experience seem to be filtered through or constructed from the material of what the person already believes or knows.
That's the argument. The source uses the example of the deity encountered. It often reflects the experiencer's current, maybe modern understanding of that deity, rather than, say, the deity's complex historical origins or earlier forms, like a modern Christian perception of God versus, say, the deity's roots in the ancient Near East.
Okay.
This cultural specificity, the source argues, suggests that these incredibly powerful experiences are being interpreted, structured, and made meaningful through our existing mental and cultural frameworks deeply interwoven with our desires, our beliefs, our need to make sense of things. It suggests they might not be offering a direct, unfiltered window onto some objective, eternal realm. But the source argues this doesn't necessarily diminish the significance of NDEs.
Not at all. Instead, it highlights something crucial. How deeply our relationship with what feels divine or transcendent is intertwined with our very human structures of desire, meaning-making, and sense-making. The NDE becomes a fascinating reflection of us.
And that leads into some broader implications the source explores,
Yeah.
like how people perceive the same divine figure so differently.
Exactly. Think about how, say, politically or socially conservative versus progressive believers might describe God or the divine, often in radically different terms, right? Maybe a stern lawgiver versus a force for liberation and justice.
Yeah, the descriptions can be almost contradictory sometimes.
And the source suggests these aren't just theological disagreements, but maybe different ways of expressing a kind of longing for an impossible ideal, a relationship with the divine that perhaps necessarily involves a productive distance, a space for desire, interpretation, and ongoing engagement.
And these different ways of relating reflect how we as humans navigate limits and possibilities more generally.
That seems to be the connection. The idea of a God setting clear boundaries finds meaning in structure, like the rules of a game providing definition. The idea of a boundless, progressive divine finds meaning in pushing limits, in openness. The source suggests both are ways we grapple with that fundamental tension between structure and freedom, limitation and possibility mirroring. Again, how desire itself seems to need both lack and potential to function.
Which definitely throws a wrench into the traditional idea of a single uniform heaven, doesn't it?
Mhm.
If believers relate to such fundamentally different versions of the divine, how could they all happily share the exact same paradise?
It's a really provocative question arising from that observation. And the source notes, intriguingly, that the fact most NDEs are reported as overwhelmingly positive, regardless of the person's specific religious background or lack thereof, might challenge rigid sectarian claims about who gets into heaven. Maybe ultimate reality, whatever it is more accommodating a variation than some doctrines suggest.
What about the flip side? Concepts like hell or karma in some contexts?
The source posits that maybe these concepts, too, arise less from direct insights into the afterlife and more from our deep-seated human desire for justice, our need for a coherent moral universe where actions have consequences.
And this raises a really critical, maybe uncomfortable question for us living now.
Yeah. Has deferring ultimate justice to an afterlife believing everything will be sorted out later actually helped us? Or has it hindered our efforts to create justice and fairness in the present?
That's a powerful reframing, because how we think about cosmic justice does seem deeply connected to how we approach social change right now.
It really does. If you believe all wrongs will be perfectly righted in the next life, maybe the urgency to fix systemic inequalities now feels less intense.
Or if the focus is solely on individual choices and their posthumous rewards or punishments, it can sometimes overshadow the impact of social structures, poverty, discrimination on people's lives and choices right now.
You see that tension reflected sometimes, don't you? Between, say, a strong emphasis on individual personal responsibility versus a focus on systemic change needed in society. Those different emphases often show up in religious discussions about judgment and justice, too.
Though, importantly, the source also points out the powerful, sometimes revolutionary potential within these religious frameworks themselves.
Absolutely. Ideas like liberation theology, focusing on freeing the oppressed now, or traditions emphasizing radical compassion, or concepts like tikkun olam in Judaism, the imperative to repair the world here and now.
So the key question the piece leaves us with isn't necessarily about proving or disproving an afterlife.
but rather how do our deeply held conceptions of ultimate justice, ultimate reality, ultimate bliss, how do they shape our willingness, our motivation, our strategies for engaging with the real inequalities and suffering we see in the world today?
And NDEs, coming back to them, their significance isn't just a clue about post-death states.
But maybe more about how we, right now, negotiate between immediate experience and ultimate meaning, between individual responsibility and collective action. How do we live with these tensions in a way that enriches the life we actually have?
Which brings us full circle, really, back to finding meaning in the present moment. The Force seems to suggest that maybe holding on to questions about the afterlife a bit more lightly, with less certainty. Maybe that's not a loss of faith, but a way to actually deepen our engagement with this life.
I think that's a key takeaway. The real value in wrestling with these paradoxes, the paradox of perfect bliss, isn't necessarily about getting definitive answers about what happens when we die. It's
Right.
about understanding how desire, lack, limitation, how these things fundamentally shape our experience now.
And when we acknowledge that, when we see desire not just as a problem to be eliminated, but as maybe inherent to our capacity for meaning.
We might actually be better equipped to face life's real challenges, its real opportunities, with more wisdom, maybe more compassion.
The Source gives some great examples of how spiritual frameworks and practices already embody this kind of wisdom, focusing on the present.
Like the Jewish Sabbath, it's not just about resting up for a future heavenly rest. It's about actively transforming ordinary time now through intentional limits and presence, finding the sacred within the constraints of this life.
Or certain kinds of Buddhist meditation, especially those that don't just try to suppress difficult emotions or cravings, but work with them.
Right. They aim to transform consciousness in this life, changing your relationship to desire rather than just hoping to eliminate it entirely someday. It's about engaging differently, more skillfully with your present reality.
And even contemporary movements, some secular, focused on death awareness. Contemplating mortality doesn't just have to be about what comes next. Often, it profoundly deepens people's appreciation for their present relationships, their present experiences.
All these practices seem to suggest that maybe the richest spiritual wisdom isn't found in having absolute certainty about a future perfect state.
But in learning how to live meaningfully within that dynamic, sometimes uncomfortable space between seeking and finding,
Yeah.
between desire and fulfillment, the very space that seems to define being human.
And realizing this doesn't have to preclude hope or belief in some form of post-death transformation. Not at all.
But it absolutely highlights the inherent value, the dignity, the meaning woven into our present consciousness with all its messy limitations, its longings, its imperfections.
Yeah. And seen in that light, religious and spiritual frameworks, when you really dive into them, can offer incredibly powerful tools, not just for speculating about the future, but for engaging more fully, more richly with the present moment, where the sacred, the profound, might already be waiting in the ordinary rhythms of life.
Oh, wow. This has been a really insightful deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, exploring that central paradox of perfect bliss, thinking about desire as maybe fundamental, looking at how different traditions wrestle with this.
And how all of that shapes how we understand ourselves, how we think about justice, even how we relate to the idea of the divine.
We've been unpacking ideas from Nick Nuances' piece, The Paradox of Perfect Bliss, which you can find in the archive of his blog, Nick's Nuances.
And as we mentioned, he covers a really fascinating range there. Philosophy, current events, religion, psychoanalysis, tech, culture. Always something interesting to chew on.
Definitely worth checking out. And for anyone whose interest was particularly piqued by some of the thinkers mentioned, Nick references the work of Jacques Lacan, Peter Rollins, and also Michael Downs, who sometimes goes by the dangerous, maybe, online.
So maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to just sit with based on everything we've talked about. If our capacity for meaning truly is tangled up with desire, with lack, with limitation, what does that tell you about the inherent value, the purpose, maybe even the beauty of the life you're living right now?
A great question to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.